Good morning. This is retired Pastor Karl Schmidt from Calvary Lutheran Church, little Lutheran church, and just outside of Buffalo, New York, in Amherst, New York. We welcome we welcome you this morning to our broadcast on YouTube, March 26, 2023, like the third year of the pandemic, but it's going much better. It's become more of a common part of life now. Most everybody is vaccinated and boosted and doing everything they can. If they're in a congested area, they wear masks, and otherwise, a lot of places you can go without a mask now. So it's getting better. Well, we're up to like I say, March 26th. It's the fifth Sunday in Lent this year. Lent is a movable festival, time-wise, in the church year. And we're up to the fifth Sunday, so that means we have one more week of Lent, then we have Holy Week. And the text that we're looking at this morning is part of the gospel text from the Gospel of John, chapter 8. We're going to be looking at verses 56 through 58. That's verses 56 through 58 of John chapter 8. Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it, and was glad. Then the Jews said unto him, You are not yet 50 years old, and you have seen Abraham? Jesus said unto them, Truly, truly, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. Here ends that portion of the gospel text from the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verses 56 through 58. Now, we live in a modern age. We live in a time of mathematics and science, and we understand that things are pretty relative, really. Even time. We know that satellites operate at a different time than we operate here on Earth. And even on Earth, it's different depending on place, because time and gravity are related to each other. If you're near a large gravitational object, time runs at one speed, but if you're couple hundred miles up in space like the satellites are, it runs at a different speed. And so constantly the satellites have to have their clocks reset, even though they're atomic clocks. Yet they run at a different pace than clocks in different places on Earth. So we know in a modern world that time is relative. Even if you're in an airplane, it runs at a different time than wherever the destination on Earth that you're coming from and going to. This is all something that we just take for granted. And if you use GPS, that is a complex series of time calculations, actually. And the differences in altitude and things like that are all worked into the calculations made in standard GPS, which we use just routinely. We don't even think about it anymore. It's just you tell your phone where you want to go, or you tell your car where your destination is, and your car knows down to the linear foot where the lane is that you should be in, where your turn is, things like that. Only possible because it understands the relativity of time and gravity and how they're related to each other. Incredibly complex. It's something that Einstein had the first glimpse of. And yet, here's the thing. When you look at the text this morning, people who heard Jesus speak probably could not imagine what he was talking about. That before Abraham was, I am. Because they would have had this idea that time passes, and from a very basic farmer perspective of time, because principally they were farmers or shepherds or lived in the little towns and were bakers or carpenters or whatever, but they had a very primitive concept of the passage of time. Jesus lived about 2,000 years ago, and science and math 2,000 years ago were quite a bit more primitive than we have today. Although the Greeks, I have to admit, the Greeks were incredibly advanced, even in mathematics, understanding some of the finer points of math and geometry. The first algorithms, for instance, were put together by Greeks as they were trying to calculate floor tiles. And so a brilliant builder came up with the first basic algorithm. And that calculated floor tiles based on your length and run. And did a nice job. So even though Greeks, you might be looking at 2,400 years ago, they were pretty advanced for their world. And even mechanically, and they had gadgets that could calculate the Olympic festivals in time and leap years. Well, not leap years, but time pretty well. The Antikytherian mechanism is one such example of that. Anyways, so, but 2,000 years ago, time was just, from a farmer point of view or primitive point of view, just, one thing after the other. That was it. Jesus comes along and he starts speaking of time and place and people as though time is easily manipulated. And again, the Jews who were listening to him were just baffled. And they said the obvious thing. You're not even 50 years old. Jesus was just barely 30 years old. And they said, you've seen Abraham? Kind of an obvious statement, because even King David would be 1000 BC, and Abraham would be some long period before even King David, and the Davidic realm of Israel. So it would be far back in time. I mean, thousands of years from our point of view. And so the Jews obviously were confused by this. It didn't make any sense to them at all. And then what Jesus said to them afterwards makes even less sense to them. He said, truly, truly, I say unto you, this is verse 58 of the Gospel of John, the 8th chapter. Truly, truly, I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. And in the Greek, it's prin, Abrahami, Genesthai, ego eimi. And prin is an adverb before. It's of time. It's an adverb of time. So before Abraham and Genesthai, which is second aorist infinitive of ginomai, means to come into existence, be created, so that at one point did not exist, and after some action existed. And so, in other words, Jesus is saying not just the time of Abraham, but before Abraham even existed, before Abraham was even created. Ego eimi, I am. Eimi is a verb of being, like to be. And so he says, look, I simply am. And this is before Abraham even existed. Well, if King David was 1000 BC and Abraham is some unknown distance of time back before that, by some thousands of years, well, what? I mean, the Jews listening, they're dumbfounded. That just doesn't make any sense. It just blows past them. And not only because they don't understand and have no concept whatsoever of the relativity of time and space and gravity and all the rest, and how these interrelate with each other. And even now, we're just children at this. We're just barely exploring the boundaries and the understanding of these relationships. Even Einstein, with his brilliant insights and glimpses of matters that are mind-boggling, especially since he made most of these discoveries in 1905, 1906. And it's true, he wrote 5 papers in 1905, 1906 that rocked the world because he advanced the idea that of light, of energy, of atomic energy, all these things, 1905. You have to remember, in 1905, even here in America, we were delivering ice by horse buggy. So because you had a wooden refrigerator with no electricity to it, and it was kept cold because you bought a block of ice, and the iceman would deliver ice, and that they were bringing milk in bottles and tins and leaving it out on your porch because the farmer's cart would come along and deliver milk. So while that was going on, Einstein was coming up with these ideas that even today, we're just beginning to explore and understand. And some of them, even CERN, the huge, massive atom smasher in Switzerland, France there, is just beginning to experimentally understand some of these ideas that Einstein came up with in 1905. But in his day, it was mind-bending. And in Jesus' day, it was considerably more mind-bending because even the very idea was leaving them in, like I say, basically farmers listening to someone give ideas that where space and time are essentially in the hand of God. And this today still matters, though. It matters not just because now we can manipulate these things and use GPS, or we have satellite communications. We have all sorts of the use of these things routinely, which to the average person doesn't mean anything. You pick up your cell phone, you call a friend, could be halfway around the world, and yet all the connections are made. And yet it uses calculations based on space-time mechanics. So, but to the average person, means nothing. Absolutely nothing. God comes along and starts speaking to human beings, and his realm is altogether so much more different than ours. And just as in Jesus' day, he was speaking essentially to farmers that lived in little towns. And even in Einstein's day, in 1905, basically, he proposed ideas that, there was not even mathematics for. In fact, he was granted a PhD on account of the mathematics that he developed to try to explain these ideas, because that mathematics didn't even exist. He invented it to explain what he was imagining. And the people in his world looked at what he proposed, and they were just blown away. And this is not that long ago, 1905. Talking about, 120 years, basically? Jesus' day, 2,000 years ago. But with God, things are even much more different. Martin Luther had an expression that the life of the first man and the life of the last man are lived in the hand of God at the same time. There's a glimpse of what the Scripture was simply teaching. I'm sure Martin Luther had no idea what he was really saying there. It's just that it was an observation based on what he was reading in the Bible, that God transcends, is outside of our idea of time and space and events. It occurred, for instance, Jesus would say, look, I'm telling you this now so that later when it happens, you'll remember back that I told you about it back here. So even before the event unfolds, I'm already telling you about it. And that after the event has unfolded, you can then retrospectively look backwards before the event. So that where A is before B and C is after B and A is no longer true. And so Jesus throws the whole cart, the horse before the cart thing, all up in the air and higgly-piggly. And see, this is, why does this matter? Why does Jesus even bother telling the Jews that Abraham rejoiced to see his day and was glad because he saw it. And they said, what? Abraham lived thousands of years ago. You couldn't. You're not even 50. You're just 30. How can you possibly have any idea? And then Jesus goes, before Abraham Genesethai, not just was, but before he even existed, I already am. Meaning very plainly his identity. He's God. Because from a human point of view, we just live out our days. One day follows the next. I'm 64, and which means that I've been on this earth and I've passed 64 birthdays. That's essentially what that means. So it's a measure of time. One follows the next. And you can't go backwards, and that doesn't work. You can tell, you have stories on Netflix or whatever of time going back and forth. Those are just cute little stories, but in our reality, time marches forward and only forward. So this is when Jesus says, look, your idea of time isn't the only idea of time. From my point of view, time exists differently. And to us now, that's rather mind-bending. Why would it matter? Why does Jesus even bother telling them this? Because look, we're not always going to live in this frame of time. Eventually, we're going to reach a point where our daily lives end. Whether it's by old age or accident or illness. I mean, we've had over 1 million people just in the United States die in the last 3 years with COVID. I mean, 1 million people. I'm sure none of them expected, or very few of them expected, to die in these last 3 years, especially from a contagious disease like COVID. And yet, there we are. We're some well past 1 million. Probably 1 million, 100,000, maybe 200,000. Who knows at this point? And so you look at that and you go, yeah, we seem to be stuck in this loop of time. And yet Jesus is saying, no. Since he is Lord over time even, he's also Lord over all that holds us. And just as we're quite subservient to time, I could lie about my age and say I'm 30, but I have kids who are more than 30. So obviously, that would be a lie. Not true. But you see, it comes a point where I will not exist. I'll be dead. And so the march of time for me will end. And yet, what God is saying, what Jesus is saying here is, look, not only is he going to change that, because for him time is different, but he's going to bring us back. He's going to resurrect us. He's going to reverse this whole death thing. How's that possible? Well, the very thing that brought us death, this separation from God, you call it sin, but sin is symptomatic. It doesn't actually describe the root of anything or the cause. It's purely symptom. And if you're stuck on symptoms and can't get past that, well, it's like a person goes to the doctor and says, "Doctor, my nose is runny, I'm coughing, and I'm sneezing, and I feel achy, and I've got a fever." And the doctor says, "Well, you're sick." And the person said, No, doctor, I have I'm sneezy, I have a headache, and I'm achy, and I've got a fever." And the doctor says, "No, you have a virus, you're sick." He says, No, I just have symptoms. And the doctor says, "No, there's a cause." And you see, with what separates us from God, those are the symptoms, not the cause. You have to be smart enough to realize that the symptoms are not the cause. Just like anybody who goes to the doctor finally has to admit, okay, yes, there's a virus that's a cause behind this. It's not the sneezes, not the fever, it's not the achy, it's not the tired. No, there's a cause. And I don't really know what the cause is with our separation from God. Call it sin, dwell on the symptoms if you must, but that's meaningless because the symptoms are never the cause. The cause is something different, and I don't have a clue. What is it that's separated us from God? What is so awful in this world that the only remedy for it, the only thing to repair that separation is that the Father, God the Father, sent his Son, Jesus, to be born of Mary, to join us in our humanity, and then to die for us in that humanity, and to rise again from the dead, having beaten this thing called death, where the penalty for sin has been satisfied. Since I don't know the cause of the separation, how would I ever really understand the remedy? It's like you ask a doctor, well, exactly what is a virus? And the doctor says, we don't really know. They're deadly, or they can be deadly. They can be annoying at the very least, but do we really know what a virus is? Not exactly. So it's just like that with sin, except it's like with a virus, they can create a vaccine, and it beats the virus. Well, the same with Jesus. The Father sent Jesus, his Son, to be here, and because of how the Father understands this, not how I understand it, but how the Father understands this, he accepts this as remedy for me and for you. And time no longer matters. Whether you're 64 or 4, doesn't matter. Because we live out our days in the hand of God. And then when our days on this earth come to an end, he says, no, you're still with me. You're still mine. And he'll bring us back. Time doesn't matter. Not to him or those who belong to him. And that is part of the core of our hope. That God holds time, space, gravity, all the reality in his hand, and all of that is at his whim, at his simple desire, at his wish. And that's how it works. So where we are subject to time and space and gravity, gravity's a little brutal, isn't it? You slip and fall, you hurt your knee. Man, gravity's tough. But time is too. And yet, God skips right past all that and takes us into another life, another world. And how will it be there? I don't know. I barely understand this world. How could I possibly understand the next? Except that Jesus says this is how it will be. And he's already there. As he says, before Abraham even existed, I already was. Okay, well, this has been retired Pastor Karl Schmidt. I hope that, I know this is confusing stuff. It's confusing for me too, but I hope that in there are some ideas that might be helpful for you. That for those of us who are a bit brutalized by time, whether age causes you arthritis or whatever problem, that eventually time will not constrain us. Time will not hold us in the same grasp, but God will bring us past that into something that's pretty different. All right, take care. Be well. Again, this is retired Pastor Karl. Bye-bye.